we pray the prayer you taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. So there was this one Sunday afternoon when two church members were going door to door to invite people to visit the church, to visit the services. When they knocked on one door, it was immediately clear that the woman who answered was not happy to see them. She told them in no uncertain terms that she did not want to hear their message, and before they could say anything more, she slammed the door in their faces. To her surprise, however, the door didn't close. In fact, it bounced back open. She tried again, really putting her back into it, and slammed it again with the same result. The door bounced back open. Convinced these rude young people were sticking their foot in the door, she reared back to give it a slam that would teach them a lesson. Just then, one of them said quietly, "Ma'am, before you do that again, you really need to move your cat." Ouch. Sometimes the job of a prophet is to proclaim the truth and to point out something that's going on that maybe other people aren't really paying attention to. So as we read through the minor prophets and as we look through some of the stuff that you don't normally read or hear about in church, we're going to be hearing from prophets who are trying to speak truth to people, and even some really hard things, as we've read. If some of you have been reading in Hosea as we've started to go through this, you read this and think, this weird stuff. I mean, this is hard stuff that he's saying. There's an old definition of a preacher, or I'm going to use it as the definition of a prophet, and the job of a prophet. And it's a way of thinking about what it is that I'm supposed to be doing up here as a prophet or as a preacher. So the job of the prophet is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. That's the job. I was reading this week a blog that where one person was responding to something where one person wrote, "Well, religion's primary job is to bring comfort to people." And this person who responded to that said, "Well, yeah, there should be some comfort, but you know what? If you're not afflicting people, if you're not challenging people in their life, then you're not speaking the whole truth. You're not doing the whole thing." There's one definition of preaching that has been described this way: a mild-mannered man standing up before mild-mannered people and exhorting them to be more mild-mannered. But that's not what the prophets are going to do. When the Hosea is preaching to the people of Israel all those years ago, he points to them and says, "You people are not living right. You guys are not being faithful to God." And this is the message that the prophet is bringing in Ephesians 4. We're going to get to Hosea in a second, so it's okay. Don't calm down. I'm going to get there. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1 is maybe the verse that we should all know and realize that this is our job as Christians. This is our job as people of Christ, the people of faith. And this is that. Instead, this is Ephesians 4:15. It says, "Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ." See, my goal as a preacher is to get you to grow to become like Jesus Christ. And I have to do that by speaking truth. I have to do it in a loving way, but it has to be the truth. It has to be the whole truth. It has to be all of the truth. And so the fact that many of you are probably hearing a sermon from the book of Hosea, maybe for the first time in your life, and some of you have had very long lives, then you realize that not always telling the truth because there are some things that we're leaving out. Now we're going to be going into Hosea, and we started it last week. So, I didn't give a little quick outline, but I thought I would, because last week we did kind of the introduction to Hosea. So the Hosea outline is that chapters 1 through 3 are the current situation in the life of Israel. Now I could go back through all of the history. Remember, there's two kingdoms at this point. There's the northern kingdom, Israel. There's the southern kingdom of Judah. They're all Jews. They're all part of the tribes, but they're divided. They're separated. I was looking at a map there. The capital city of Samaria of the northern kingdom and the capital city of Jerusalem in the southern kingdom are actually closer together than we are to Coos Bay. Yeah, they're very close together. They're not separated by very far. And Bethel, which is the main sanctuary, the worship center of that, is even closer to Jerusalem than Samaria is. So it's not like these people are it's not like they got God brought them up and said, okay, you're going to have a civil war, so I'm going to divide you. I'm going to put you way over here. That's what you do with your kids, right? You have 2 kids. You guys are fighting, so I'm going to put you way over there and put you way over there, or put somebody in the... No, God says, hey, you're going to live right next to each other. You're brothers and sisters. And so this problem that you're having is because you're not really following after me. So the current situation is chapter 1 through 3, and Hosea then compares that situation to a marriage where one of the spouse is being unfaithful. But the unfaithfulness is not to the other Jewish country, but the unfaithfulness is to God. God says, I have a covenant relationship with you, and you are not fulfilling your end of the covenant, the obligation. And he compares that to an unfaithful spouse. And it's pretty, we're not going to read, we read chapters 1 and 2 last week. It's pretty fairly graphic if you read it. And it uses words like prostitution and being unfaithful, and has a lot of sexual innuendos and things. And we're going to see more of that today, because that's the primary way in which the prophets talk about our relationship with God. And this is true in the New Testament too. It's not something that the Old Testament does, but the New Testament. We are collectively the bride of Christ. Amen. We are married to God in the same way that Israel was in the Old Testament. And so that's where the warning comes in. So the next few chapters, in fact, most of the book is the indictments, the things that they are doing that are showing that they are not being faithful to God. And also along with that is the verdict. And then chapter 14, so we got a long ways to go before we get to the call to repentance. Now, this means, go back to that original job. Comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Hosea and a lot of the prophets spend most of their time afflicting the comfortable. So when we read this, we will see from time to time they will refer to some hope as something that's going to happen in the future. But the prophets spend a lot of time pointing fingers at people and saying, y'all need to change. They say it just like that. That's the Hebrew term that they use. Y'all need to change. And so that's the message that we need to get, is to realize that God cares what we do with our lives. He wants you to be faithful to Him. And we're going to go to Hosea. I could probably have just kept right on preaching that topic and just kept saying that same thing over and over and over again, and it would have been a good sermon. But I'm going to mess it up by going and reading Hosea, right? So, Hosea 4, verse 1 says, Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites. I've always thought that I should really start every sermon that way. Hear the word of the Lord, you Cordorfians, or whatever it is that we call it. Because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. Those are three terms that are all directed towards God. So when it says there is no faithfulness to God, no love to God or for God, no acknowledgement of God in the land. He said the land twice in that verse. You notice that? You know why? Because the land was one of the primary promises that God gave Abraham all the way back when he started this whole group of Israelites. And then God, even though the people aren't always faithful, he put them in the land. He kept his promise. And now he points his finger at them and says, but you aren't. You are not. I've done my part. I brought you in the land. I made you a people. Now, you guys are not responding correctly. So, as we will see, not so much this week, but coming weeks, God's going to say, fine, if you're not going to live up, if you're not going to be faithful, if you're not going to love me back, if you're not going to even acknowledge me, then guess what? I'm going to take you out of the land. I'll take away the promises that I gave you. And that's the threat that's going to come. That's why we'll see over and over and over again this idea of the land. He keeps bringing it up, talking about the land. And we have to keep that in mind. The land is like the most visible fulfillment of promise that God gave to those people, the Israelites. That's why they celebrated today, about being back in the land. But this is where we have to be careful about talking about Israel, because the measure of Israel's staying in the land then is what? Whether or not they are faithful to God, whether they are loving God, whether they are even acknowledging God. That's what we look for. Because God's perfectly capable of saying, fine, you're not going to do that? I'll take you out of the land again. That's part of what God does. That's as most political I'm going to get as I'm going to get today, all right? So, go on then to verse 2. Keep those in mind. No faithfulness to God, no love of God, no acknowledgement of God. Then in verse 2, it says, there is only cursing, lying and murder, stealing and adultery. That's the only. That's the kind of word that I underlined there, right? There is only cursing. Cursing there has the idea of taking the Lord's name in vain. Treating God like he doesn't matter. That's what cursing is. Lying and murder, stealing and adultery, they break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea are swept away. Before God takes them out of the land, the first thing he does is he makes it really difficult for the land to produce anything. So it's kind of like a step. I put you in the land. Remember, God promises that it'll be a land flowing with milk and honey. It'll be productive. There'll be all kinds. So the first step is the land stops being productive. And of course, as we think about what happens then, is that the people of Israel then turn to other gods and say, well, we'll turn to them and hope that they can make our land productive. They can produce crops for us. And God is telling them here, look, I'm the God. If I decide your land's not going to be productive, it ain't going to be productive. Go ahead. You're praying to them, but you're going the wrong direction. You're not being faithful to me. And the second thing in that verse, and we'll kind of come back to this a little bit as we go through the other prophets too, is notice it talks about beasts and birds and fish. You know, the interesting thing is that sin in life, or our unfaithfulness to God, particularly as a collective group, affects everything that goes on in a country or in a land. It's not just us, But sin actually creates problems all through nature, all through our relationships, all through one of the reasons why when we brought up praying for kids. Why are kids so anxious today? Why are they depressed? Why are they? Well, part of it is because there's no acknowledgement of God. There's no faithfulness to God. There's no love for God. And so the whole land suffers when that happens.
That's right.
In verse 4, it says, but let no one bring a charge, let no one accuse another, for your people are like those who bring charges against a priest. You stumble day and night, and the prophets stumble with you, so I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. The lack of knowledge there goes back to what he said earlier. Knowledge, not generally knowledge, not like science. Knowledge of God. That's the knowledge he's talking about. And you remember that says, I will destroy your mother. And you think, wow, that's good. It's just my parents that are going to have the problem. I'm okay. No, who does the mother represent? Go back to chapters 1 and 2. It represents the nation that is being unfaithful to God. So I will destroy your nation is basically what he's saying. And then it says, my people, individuals, are also going to suffer. But he starts off this section by saying, let no one bring a charge. Let no one accuse another. And you think, well, wait a minute, isn't that what Hosea is doing? Well, yeah, that's what Hosea is doing, because one of the things that happens, and we see this in our country, this is absolutely true, is that everybody blames somebody else. Yes, if everybody would just be like me, we would all be getting along fine.
Right.
If you would just listen to what I have to say, it's your fault. It's you people on the other side of the aisle. You people on the other side of the country. You people, it's them, it's they, and that's all. And that's where our country is right now. All we do is bring a charge, accuse one another. But the only accusation that matters is the one that God is making through Hosea. And so the question is, am I faithful to God? Am I loving God? Am I acknowledging God and his presence everywhere I go? Am I the one who is cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery? See, because our personal character matters. Who we are as a church, who we are as God's people, is the testimony. But we would rather just point to other people and say, it's your fault. It's you. If you would just straighten up and fly right, then we would be fine. But we need to realize that Hosea is talking to God's people. That's what he says here. My people are destroyed. We have to live out what we believe about God. We can't be like other people. The second part of verse 6 then says, because, now he's noticing he says, because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priest. He's getting particular right now. So there's part of me that just says, I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to talk about those other pastors and priests that are the problem, right? Because that's what I just said. Were you listening to what I just said? That's the wrong way to look at it. This part of it, he's really talking to the religious leaders. And he's saying, you religious leaders aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is, go back to the beginning, speak the truth in love. You have to be speaking the truth. You got to be teaching the things of God. You have to be doing that, priest. It's your job to do that. You need to afflict the comfortable. Because if you're not, then they're not going to change. But it keeps coming back. I know that I get together with other pastors from time to time, and you know what our favorite thing to do is talk about how terrible the people are in our churches, and how they're so hard to get along with, and it's all their fault. But see, that's the same thing that I'm just saying. That's what we do as people. It's always the other people. Whatever side you're on, it's them that's the problem. If they would just change, life would. And Hosea say, no, you need to change. So this part is kind of directed towards me particularly, but make my job easier and just do what I tell you. Okay? Just listen to what I'm saying. To the extent that I'm speaking for God, then you need to listen to that. Let's just do that. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priest. Because you have ignored the law of your God, I also will ignore your children. The more priests there were, the more they sinned against me. You skip more pastors, because that'll help, right? They exchanged their glorious God for something disgraceful. They feed on the sins of my people and relish their wickedness. And it will be like people, like priests. I will punish both of them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. I'm glad I got to that verse because I was kind of feeling pretty bad about myself right there because I'm thinking, oh, he's blaming me. But then he turns right around and says, you know what really happens? Priests tell the people what they want to hear. So when we go back to that little thing I said earlier about mild-mannered people, hearing mild-mannered messages, that's what people want. What people want to hear is, just make me feel good. Make me think that I'm okay. And then God keeps messing it up by saying, here's the thing, you're not okay. That's what he does. You're not okay. You're cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery. You're not faithful to me. You're not loving me. You're not following the law, as he talks about here. Oh, by the way, all those things, cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery, those are the commandments, the 10 commandments. And he says, you're not doing them. You're not following them. Now, it's even more interesting because if you go to this thing in the New Testament, you ever heard of the Sermon on the Mount? You know what Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount? He talks about cursing, lying and murder, stealing and adultery. And he talks about how people are following the letter of the law, but they're not following the spirit of the law. So actually, when we think about these things today, it's a little more complicated even than it was then, probably. If you call somebody a fool, you're killing them. Don't curse, don't swear to God. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Those are the kinds of things that Jesus talks about. And these are the kinds of things that he's talking about. And it will be like people, like priests. So, indictment number 1. Some of you thought I would never get to the indictment. But it says, but I say, we have to be on guard that we are not allowing sin to gain a foothold in our lives. Doesn't matter. It kind of comes back to the idea of speaking the truth. We can't speak the truth if we're not living the truth. We can't accuse other people of lying if we are not telling the truth ourselves. We can't talk about their killing somebody if we're killing somebody. You just can't do it that way. You have to be on guard all the time. Oh, you don't understand. I have faith in Jesus Christ. I'm saved. I have the Holy Spirit. I don't have to worry about any of these things. And Hosea is going to say to you, if Hosea was standing up right now, he would be I'm being a lot nicer than he would have been. That's what I'm saying when we read this. He would have pointed at you and said, really? Let's just play you ever see those the commercials they have out now with the little throw the flag and you can do a replay and it's two people arguing about, no, you said this, no, you did this, and they and then they show a replay. Aren't you glad we don't actually have that? We find out that we look back over our lives over the last few days and realize, whoa, maybe I wasn't exactly as truthful then as I could have been. Maybe I did think some things about that person that I shouldn't have been thinking. I mean, all of a sudden we realize, this whole faithfulness idea to God is important. That's kind of what I try to say with this indictment, is talking about that faithfulness part. We have to be on guard, not allowing sin. That's what it means to be faithful to God. I am measuring my life and finding out, am I being true to God? Am I being loyal to God? Am I being faithful to God? When I say I have faith in God, do I really have faith in God? Or am I just saying stuff? Or am I saying what other people want to hear? So, that's indictment number 1. So, the change then is verse 10. He goes on to the next thing. They, that's the priests and the people, they will eat but not have enough. They will engage in prostitution but not flourish, because they have deserted the Lord to give themselves to prostitution, old wine and new wine, and take away their understanding. My people consult a wooden idol. A diviner's rod speaks to them. A spirit of prostitution leads them astray. They are unfaithful to their God. They sacrifice on the mountaintops and burn offerings on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, where the shade is pleasant. I like that little phrase. I do the religious stuff when it's nice and comfortable and it's easy, and I get a nice peaceful little place, and I do all of these things. And then it says, therefore your daughters turn to prostitution and your daughters-in-law to adultery. Then he says this interesting thing. I will not punish your daughters when they turn to prostitution, nor your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery, because the men themselves consort with harlots and sacrifice with shrine prostitutes. A people without understanding will come to ruin. Going back to that acknowledgement of God. Lack of understanding means you don't understand what God is saying to you. Now we get this picture. When we talk about this and we talk about the prophets, they use a lot of poetry. And so when he's talking about prostitution here, it's on two levels. On one hand, which is kind of hard for us to believe, but in a lot of the cults at the time that were worshiping other God, there was actual sexual activity that was going on at the temples. They were literally prostitutes there. That was part of the worship. The idea, and I'm not saying this is a good idea or that it even makes sense, but the idea is you go have sex with this prostitute, and somehow that convinces the god to bring productive fruit to your land. Makes sense, right? Well, it did to them. But and we kind of look at that and think, well, what is going on here? But we also need to realize that when he talks about prostitution here, he's talking spiritually. These people are actually going to other places and worshiping other gods when they owe that activity to God. They are being adulterers. Idolatry. That's the part about sacrifice on the mountaintops, burnt offerings on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth. Because trees, one of these days you'll have to just do a word search on trees. There's lots of trees in the Bible, but the trees have always been kind of a popular spiritual location. Worship under the trees or in the trees. Special trees. And he's saying, the problem is that I'm telling you, the place you are to worship is Jerusalem. That's where the temple is. That's where I am. That's where you are to come and worship me. But instead, you're going to all these, here it says mountaintops, but the Bible has this phrase called high places. You probably maybe have heard that. And that's where people would go. Tops of mountains. Find a grove of trees, special trees. And they're doing all this religious activity there because they think that is where they will get success in their life. That's I will worship Baal there, or Ashtaroth, or Dagon, and remember that from the Philistines. I will worship these other gods, and they will then give me success. I will have a productive farm. I will have lots of sheep or flocks. I will make lots of money. That's the goal. If I give out, if I do all of that stuff, my life will be better. And God is saying in this, you're not going to. That first verse, they will eat but not have enough. Oh, sure, you'll have stuff, but you'll never be satisfied. You'll never be at peace. You'll never be who you want to be. You will always be striving after something. Why? Well, one reason is because these other gods can't do anything. I'm the one who does those things, God says. So indictment number 2 against them is what we spend our time and money on shows who we worship. They're going to these other places and they're giving money to these other temples and these other gods. They're giving money to prostitutes. They're spending their time doing these things. And that ultimately shows people and ourselves who our God is. That was one of the things they talk about from time to time as a pastor is if I could just look at your checkbook, I could figure out who your God is. And some of you are hiding your checkbooks right now. I'm not going to do that, by the way, but you should do that. Look at the money you spend. What are you spending it on? Look at the time you spend. What are you spending your time doing? That is whatever that is your God. And that's what God is saying to them. You don't love me. If you did, you would spend your time and your money on me, God says, and on the things that I want you to do, rather than other things. There's no love. There's no faithfulness, the earlier one. This one's talking about that love of God. Do you love God? Then spend your time worshiping God, not other things. Spend your money on worshiping God, following God, doing the things of God. Hosea is just poking them. And I think, and I hope, he's poking us. I almost said you, and I thought, I better not do that. I better include myself in this too. It's us. Speaking the truth. That's what Hosea is doing. Matthew 6:33 is a very familiar verse. It's from the Sermon on the Mount that I referenced earlier. And you've all seen this verse a lot of times. Verse 6:33 says, "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." Now, we have to keep the order right. You know what we do is, we look at the second half of the verse, and we want all these things. I want money, I want a nice family, I want a good job, so in order to get that, I will maybe try to please God a little. I'll go to church, I'll say I believe in Jesus, but my real goal is to get these other things. Okay? That's exactly the opposite of what Jesus said. Jesus said, spend your money and your time in seeking me, and then you won't have to worry. Those other things will come. Those other things will happen. By the way, happens a lot in evangelism. Yeah, you want peace in your life? You want your marriage to be fixed? Do you want a good job? Believe in Jesus and all this stuff. No. Believe in Jesus first, and then other stuff will take care of itself. You got to follow Jesus. That's what you have to do. You have to seek God. You have to. One way that I put it in the past is you have to want what God is offering, and God is offering Jesus. I got to get back to Hosea because I got to get through chapter 4. So if I'm going to get through the prophets, in my lifetime, I got to keep going. So verse 15 of Hosea says, "Though you, Israel, commit adultery, do not let Judah become guilty." Let me just stop for a second and say, if you go back to the first verse of Hosea, he talks about how he preached during the kingdoms of this king from Israel and these kings from Judah. His primary audience is Israel. Israel, the northern kingdom, you need to change. But part of what maybe even his ultimate goal is to get Judah, the southern kingdom, who thinks they're on the right track, who thinks they're the better of the two, to pay attention to what happens to Israel, because it's going to happen to them too if they don't look out. And so that's what he says. Though you, Israel, commit adultery, Israel, I'm talking to you, you need to change. Judah, pay attention, because it's coming for you too. You have to be careful. Then it says, do not go to Gilgal, do not go up to Bethaven, and do not swear as surely as the Lord lives. That's using the Lord's name in vain, because you say as surely as the Lord lives as a swearing, but you don't really believe it. It's not. You're just using it to try to convince other people how good an honest person you are. So Gilgal and is another religious place in the northern kingdom. It's a place where people went to worship God, at least theoretically. Beth Aven is interesting because it's actually a derogatory term. I mentioned earlier there's a place called Bethel. The word Beth in Hebrew means house. El is God. So Bethel means house of God. Beth Aven is a derogatory term referring to Bethel, but it means house of wickedness. That's what Aven means there. So we'll see it as we go through the prophets from time to time and realize they're not talking about a separate place. They're talking about Bethel, which is the place where supposedly they're worshiping God, but they're not, and the prophets call it Beth Aven. And we're supposed to pick up on that. Aren't you glad you came today? Because you just learned something, right? So if you ever see Beth Aven anywhere in the Old Testament, it's a derogatory term about Bethel. So write that down, and if you don't remember anything else about this morning, you'll remember that. I know, because that's the kind of thing I remember. Anyway, so don't go there. Don't follow them, Judah. Don't do what Israel's doing. Verse 16 says, the Israelites are stubborn, like a stubborn heifer. How then can the Lord pasture them like lambs in a meadow? Interesting little picture there. Cows are stubborn, and supposedly anyway, sheep are not. No, sheep aren't stubborn. Usually it's sheep are stupid. But anyway, it's a totally different thing. But anyway, the point he's making there is, and I grew up on a small ranch where I always had 5 or 6 steers, and that's primary source of meat. And I can tell you, cows are stubborn. They will not go the direction you tell them to go. They always want to go the other way. They always do. Sheep are different. Sheep follow the herd or the flock, and they'll go whatever everybody else is doing, which tells us why, one of the reasons why God uses sheep as an example of us, right? Because we just kind of follow the crowd. We just go wherever, So anyway, there's a word picture here. Verse 17 says, Ephraim is joined to idols. Leave him alone. Now you're saying, well, who's this Ephraim guy? We're talking about Israel. Well, Ephraim is one of the major tribes of the northern kingdom. So when you see Ephraim, he's talking about the northern kingdom of Israel. So Israel is joined to idols. Leave him alone. He's still talking to Judah now. Don't do what Israel's doing, Judah. Don't follow that. They are joined to these other gods now. Verse 18, even when their drinks are gone, they continue their prostitution. Their rulers dearly love shameful ways. A whirlwind will sweep them away, and their sacrifices will bring them shame. Starting to get into that verdict part. Israel's going to be destroyed. Hosea probably wrote about 30 years or so, a generation, before Israel as a northern kingdom ceases to exist. A nation called Assyria will come in and just destroy, take them all out of the land. Oh, that's the whirlwind will sweep them away. If you don't change your ways, God's going to act. God's going to do something. It's coming. That's not the popular way for prophets, at least in our day particularly. No, it's all good. Everything's going to be good. We're going the right direction. Everything's going to be happy. That's what every politician is going to promise you. Maybe we should start voting for politicians who tell us the truth. That's just, I'm just going to throw that out there, all right? But right now you're feeling, hopefully right now you came to church today comfortable, and now you're feeling a little afflicted. Oh wait, I didn't do the indictment number 3, I'm sorry. Even though the world is getting worse, we are tempted to be like them. That's the warning to Judah. You see where Israel's going, don't be like them. But it's amazing how often churches want to be like the world. Let's convince people that we're no different than they are. We're all the same. Well, why do I come to church then? If you're just like me, why should I put my faith in God? we need to be different. We need not to be like the world. But the temptation is always, we don't want to speak the truth because then people won't come to church. No, we got to speak the truth because that's what God calls us to do. Okay, so now I can go back to the afflicted part. Hopefully you came today comfortable and you're thinking right now, I'm kind of afflicted. I've been picked on this morning. Pastor, you're kind of mean to me. So we want to end this, I want to end this with, particularly as we're going into the Christmas season. Back in Hosea chapter 1, verse 11, there's a promise from God through Hosea to Israel and Judah. And it says, the people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together. They will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. That first part. Right now you guys are divided. But the promise is someday I'm going to bring you together under one leader. I know what you're thinking. Who's that leader? Let's look at, we're going to jump ahead to chapter 3, verse 5. Same kind of thing. He just spent a whole couple chapters talking about how terrible these things are. And then he says, afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last day. He says, hey, there's a leader coming. There's a king coming. There's a king like David coming. You're all sitting there, who is this king, right? Who's this person that's going to come? In Luke chapter 1. I was trying to decide if I was going to, I'm going to read this in a second, but just sometime this next month or so, think about Hosea, how he was told by God to marry a promiscuous woman and a woman who would be unfaithful to him. And then think about Joseph in the New Testament and what he's told to do. Mary comes to him and says, I'm pregnant. Now to the world, she's been unfaithful. Now God tells Joseph something different. But actually, in a lot of ways, Joseph is told to do exactly what Hosea was told to do. But Joseph knew that it was not true. I mean, he knew. But from the world's perspective, they would have looked at it exactly the same. Just something to think about. But this is what the angel says to Mary. But the angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's, Israel's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. Amen. The angel tells Mary exactly what Hosea told Israel 700 years before. Who's that king? Jesus. Hey, you guys got it. Hey, that's why we can celebrate at Christmas time, right? So, Jesus, I'm going to put it in words so that you can just sink right into your head. Jesus is the king promised by the prophets. What Hosea says to Mary, says to us. Amen. Let's bow our heads and pray.